Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Zeina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining today's virtual briefing session. This is an on-the-record session, and we will discuss the U.S.-Iran relations. Iran says it's ready to return to nuclear talks with the U.S., but only if it gets firm guarantees that there won't be any more attacks. The offer comes in the wake of the 12-day war, which saw the U.S. join Israel in striking Iran's nuclear sites. Now, with the fighting over, the question is, what's next for U.S.-Iran relations? Is there a path to diplomacy, or are both sides bracing for another round of confrontation? To answer those questions and more, we're joined by Alan Eyre, a distinguished diplomatic fellow here at MEI. Is a former senior State Department diplomat, and he served as a core member of the U.S. nuclear negotiating team with Iran from 2010 to 2015. The briefing will also feature Jason Campbell, senior fellow at MEI. Jason has previously served in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy, and today is Jason's first MEI briefing, so welcome, Jason. And thank you both for joining us this morning. All right, before we get started, the usual housekeeping items. We'll have a Q&A session during a Q&A segment during this session. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function in Zoom or use the Q&A function to type your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can throughout this hour. All right, let's get started with Alan. Alan, now that the dust of war has settled to a certain extent, what's your reading of what transpired in those 12 days of war?
Before I answer that, I have to point out that in addition to this being Jason's first talk for MEI, it's also the 15th anniversary of the signing, or excuse me, the 10th anniversary of the signing of the JCPOA. So a nice little historical factoid. Yeah, well, the dust has settled, but there's going to be a lot more dust. I mean, first, to revert to the tyranny of the obvious, tactically, Israel just whooped Iran's backside. You know, every single hard or main strategic priority it had, it accomplished. It also had, I think, a secondary desire of if not toppling the regime, so degrading it as to make it functionally inert. That hasn't happened yet, but it significantly decreased not only Iran's ability to project power outside its borders, and that's part of a longer dynamic, over the last year or so, but also to defend itself. So one of the key open questions now is that to what extent Israel is going to allow Iran to try to reconstitute all the systems that gave it a sort of strategic homeostasis. I don't think it will. Finally, it also reinforced Iran's strategic calculations, which is we're alone in the international system. No one's going to help us, and we cannot depend on anybody, Russia, China, certainly not the US and Israel, who combined are trying to topple us to vent ourselves. So I think, as we've talked about before, the 12-day war was the continuation and the intensification of an existing dynamic. And to a large extent, Israel is still in the driver's seat in terms of what happens next.
How has this war impacted Iran's internal calculations?
Well, it's reinforced, I think, the worldview of the people running Iran, which is the West wants regime change, and diplomacy, though we have to revert to it from time to time, cannot be trusted. So, I mean, people make noise of the fact that there are internal political divisions inside Iran. It has ever been thus. It's like that in any country. So I wouldn't make too much hay of whatever internal debate is going on. As I said, I think these attacks reinforced the prevailing strategic worldview of those entities, primarily security and military, that are actually running Iran. And so I think right now Iran is trying to figure out how best to build up whatever strategic deterrent capabilities it has. So I don't think this attack made Iran weaker in the sense of toppling into an alternate form of government, though it obviously has become and will become more nationalistic and more militarized. Even before this happened, Iran was spending more and more money on security and on military, and that's only going to intensify, unfortunately, because as we all know, the Iranian economy is horrible, and what happened during those 12 days is bound to make it much worse.
You did mention regime change, that this, at least this is what, I mean, we did see Israeli officials mention that this was one of the goals of the 12-day war. Then they sort of decided that that wasn't the time for it. First, how do you feel? I mean, if regime change was to happen, how would that impact Iran, and the security situation in the region?
Well, it already has happened, you know? So, I mean, this attack has changed the strategic calculations of the current regime, and they also killed Israel.
Mm.
Much of the military leadership was responsible for providing and implementing a strategic vision to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has got to die sometime. He's approaching death asymptotically, but one has to assume that he will eventually perish, and that will be a key event. So, yeah, I think, as I said, it's the regime. I mean, regime change in the sense that people in the West think about it, which is an alternate form of government that's more pro-West. I think that's unlikely. Some people say that this attack of this 12-day war has strengthened the hand of the Iranian reformist element within the regime. I don't see that. I still don't see President Pezeshkian as really significant in any way. Um, so it I don't see this strengthening the reformist hand, and I certainly don't see it strengthening whatever entities within and outside of Iran are seeking an alternate form of government. Instead, I see it more likely making this regime more militaristic, more isolationist, and emphasizing also the security aspect of it, because one of the key features of this 12-day war was how thoroughly penetrated Iran was by Israeli intelligence. And Iran is already, rounded up not just the usual suspects, but a whole bunch of other people. So Iran is going to be eating itself in terms of trying to find whatever fifth column it can find or create to help justify Mossad's dominance in the intelligence sphere, which is still ongoing, in terms of Israeli cyber attacks.
Yeah, but like obviously Khamenei is 85 at this point, and uh, the regime is bound to change soon in the sense that the figure at the top will change at some point. How would that impact Iran? Would the IRGC just take over, or right now they've assassinated several of the key military figures? How will that reflect on Iran?
Well, it will. I mean, there's short, medium, and long term. Short term, whomever replaces Khamenei is going to be weak.
Hmm.
That position is strong over long periods of time. When Khamenei was originally picked, he had no power whatsoever, functionally, but his power came from installing his people in key positions and accessing revenue streams, and over time, building up a network of people beneath him who relied on him and whom he could rely on. Whomever replaces Khamenei will have to do that same thing. But in the short term, whoever it is will be very weak and will be bound to more or less follow what he perceives to be the Khamenei line. And that means, since power abhors a vacuum, that the IRGC will have the whip hand, will have the institution of the IRGC, will have Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, will play a dominant role in the short term. In the long term, yeah, it makes a difference. Whomever is chosen, and actually one of the most interesting things I saw in the 12-day war was a Reuters piece saying that actually they were contemplating picking Hassan Khomeini, Khomeini's relatively reformist grandson, as the next supreme leader. That was an option, which would be mind-blowing were that the case, because it's always been my operating assumption that whoever is picked will be ideologically sympathetic with Supreme Leader Khamenei. So in the long term, yeah, I mean, that's going to be a definitive event. Khamenei's ruled since 1989. He's one of the longest serving leaders in the world. And over time, he's increasingly consolidated his hold over power. So, he's the primum inter pares now. And that could replicate itself with the next supreme leader, or the next supreme leader could, in fact, become a ceremonial, vestigial, performative position with the real power being held by the IRGC. A lot of it depends on how well the next supreme leader, plays his hand over time.
All right, Jason, the US intelligence is still evolving regarding the impact of the US airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. We saw some contradicting reports coming out of certain intelligence agencies here in the US, and then the administration having a different take on when it comes to the damage assessment. In your assessment, how would you assess the efficacy of these strikes? And what are some lessons the US can draw from this operation?
Well, I think if you're looking efficacy, I think you have to start with Operation Lion, which, as Alan correctly stated, was I think the component of that that's going to be studied for a long time going forward is the intel part of that. This was not just a strike that came up, under quick planning. What we're learning now is that there were pre-positioned drone, one report called Victory, on the ground there with Mossad and even Israeli commandos ready at the outset to use these new tools, main communications nodes against raiders, against air defense systems, and really render Iran's ability to defend itself or even see the strike coming all but impossible. So the story of how it transpired and built up, I think, is still evolving. And now on the other side of the spectrum, when you look at the U.S. side of things, Operation Midnight Hammer, again, the battle damage assessment is still coming. You had 14 of the penetrators dropped on the three Iranian nuclear sites, particularly Fordow, where we're still awaiting. Again, the overall damage is still being conducted and will be, I think, for in the coming months. There seems to be, based on available report and conversations with stakeholders, an estimate coalesce around the 1 to 2 year period in terms of the disruption to Iran nuclear program. However, still the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium are largely felt to still somewhere in the and the status of the centrifuges that would be required to take that from 60 to 90% enrichment. There are estimates that say some of those are still indeed intact. So, we've heard words like obliterated, completely destroyed used. Of course, these all depend on how you define those terms, but the general sense now, at least here in Washington, is that there is a significant disruption, but the longer impact remains to be seen.
Great, thank you. We do have a question already. First, for callers on the line, as I mentioned, you're welcome to write your questions in the Q&A or use the raise hand function, and I'll unmute you and you could direct your question to one or both of our panelists. We already have a question from Wallace Hayes. Wallace wants to know, he said, it appears that the weakening of Iran by Israel in such a decisive fashion has changed regional perceptions of other Gulf leaders. They seem to have shifted from viewing Iran as a primary threat to viewing Israel as overly powerful and unchecked. Do you think others in the region will start viewing Israel as their primary threat? And does this include Saudi Arabia? Let's start with you, Jason.
I think not unjustifiably there is concern in the Gulf, in particular, that the degree to which Israel was successful in these strikes. I think there's concern that Israel now holds at least a de facto veto over the pursuit of some political discussions and deliberations. They feel that their equities, Israeli equities, are not covered in the discussions. We saw just a few months ago the administration hash out a separate with the Houthis, with the consultations with Israel, and demonstrate, I think, more influence in how it conducted its relations with the region. I think the aftermath of Operation Line and Midnight Hammer, I think, justified some concern in the minds of the Arab stage, and that question whether Israel was the driving force behind that extent. The U.S. would be willing to use some of its political capital with Israel to push forward much needed political agreements, be it with Iran or Gaza, a couple of other situations in the region.
All right, thank you, Jason. Alan?
Yeah, I agree with Jason. I mean, I think the prevailing view in the Gulf now is that Israel is the new regional hegemon, and worryingly, it seems far more likely to use military force than it has been historically. So I think, Mona Yacoubian, I said a while ago, she said the region is much more Hobbesian now. Yani, there's just less of a system of international law or, commonly agreed to restraints. It's a new dynamic. I think what Israel is doing in Gaza, is making it less in the West Bank, making it less likely to, for the whatever extension of the Abraham Accords that President Trump et al. Are seeking, or that even Netanyahu is seeking. So it's become a much tougher neighborhood. Whatever regional policing mechanisms don't exist. I mean, the good news for many is that, yeah, I mean, Iran's been defanged. Its proxy system is gone. Its missile system has been decimated. It can't defend its own airspace. So in the short term, the capability of Iran to cause trouble in the region has significantly decreased, thanks to Israel. We can't overlook that. Um, Whether Israel's attacks have modified Iranian intention to become more of a regional military power and have a greater deterrent capability, that's the midterm and long-term question.
All right, thank you, Alan. I have another question from Tom O'Connor from Newsweek. Tom wants to know, if the next supreme leader is expected to be weak, who are some of the individuals in Iran that you expect to become more influential over time? And if the reformist bloc, including President Pezeshkian, remains weak, are there ways the United States may be able to take advantage from the shifting internal power dynamics of Iran to advance a diplomatic solution? Alan, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, I'll answer the second one first. No. The US at its best was not good at the sort of subtle manipulation of other polities that would derive some form of government that was pro-West or pro-US. And especially now with the current US administration, we just don't have the expertise or necessarily even the desire, to engage in these sort of intricacies. Democracy these days is a very blunt tool that's rusting. So no, I don't think that. First of all, I think the reformists are of minor importance in Iran, and even if they were stronger, I don't think the U.S. has the ability to interface with it in a way to strengthen, at least in a way that's practical. I mean, the U.S. has tremendous ability to positively affect change in Iran and to strengthen the reformists by lifting sanctions on Iran, but that's not going to happen. So in terms of the first part of the question, I mean, there's no specific name of one person. There's no secular or military Khomeini-esque figure, because Khomeini's power derives almost purely from the institution he's headed since 1989. But collectively, the leaders of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, will play a greater role in the years following the installation of a new supreme leader. I mean, the only other time there was a regime change like this was, when Khomeini died, and Khomeini's power was essentially different than Khamenei's, and that it derived from his personality, his religious learning, his ability to marshal support. When Khamenei came in, the real powers that counterbalanced him were Khomeini's son Ahmad, who was a power behind the scenes, and Rafsanjani. And as our colleague Alex Vatanka has written a good book on, over time, Khamenei weakened Rafsanjani and strengthened himself. Again, that could happen, or it could be the case that whomever the next supreme leader is will never be that strong. It'll be, a largely performative role. But the powers the only institution, the strongest institution in Iran right now is the IRGC. This 12-day war didn't weaken them, though it did kill a lot of leaders. And the killing of the leaders wasn't just during the 12-day war. Don't forget, Israel has been killing IRGC leaders in the region, for years before that. So the IRGC as an institution has a serious bone to pick with Israel, which is one of the reasons why I think that diplomacy and reconciliation is less likely. Just like if you look at the current crop of U.S. military leaders, a lot of them lost friends in Iraq due to Iran's influence during the Iraq War, IED, so forth and so on. And that really influenced, I think, many of what now are senior management, in the Defense Department. Same things happen with the IRGC. A lot of their friends have been killed by Israel, and they're not going to forget that.
Absolutely. Jason, anything to add?
No, that was a great answer. I think we can move on to the next question.
All right, we have a question from Colonel Morogi. He wants to know, how does this outcome with weakened Iran affect its proxy in Iraq and elsewhere? We have not heard much from these players. Jason, can we start with you?
Sure. Yes. I think, yes, we're seeing that sort of Iran's, longing forward defense doctrine is looking as weak now as, likely it ever has. Aside from its, some of the Iraqi groups that it once supported and it had more control over, seem to be operating more independence based on, political calculations. Has lost obviously a key territory in Syria. It's the Hamas and Hezbollah are certainly at the very least on their back foot right now. The Houthis have remained, I think, stubbornly resilient, as we've seen over these last few days in carrying out a couple of more strikes in the Red Sea. But yeah, I think from a broader strategic doctrinal position, Iran now, I think, to probably recalculate, reconfigure how it's going to provide for its own self-defense, certainly in the wake of having, its air defenses, but severely damaged and unable to some of these new and new equipment and new tactics exercised by the U.S. and Israel. One watch, I would say, is recent reports the Chinese potentially resupplying Iran with some more advanced air defense missiles. China has, not surprisingly, those reports, but it's something that, as we, much as about Russia and China not immediately coming to Iran defense in more than diplomatically. I think one thing to watch for in these coming weeks and months is the degree to which they try to continue to work with the Iranian regime, even if it's just in a defensive sort of from a defensive perspective.
All right, Alan, anything to add?
No, Jason hit the nail on the head. The only thing I would add is sort of the larger question that interests me is that to what extent Iran tries to rebuild what it lost as opposed to trying something different. Does it try to, reconstitute to the extent it can the entirety of its proxy network? Just like, does it try to reconstitute as best it can the entirety of its nuclear program? Or does it try something else. Generals always fight the last war. So does Iran, try to, back to the future? Or does it try to have a strategic rethink? None of that's going on right now, because right now they're still sort of doing rope-a-dope and just trying to catch a breath, engage the US diplomatically. But, these are strategic decisions Iran has to make, as Jason pointed out. Do they just try to rebuild what's been lost, even though it didn't work in the past, both with proxies or nuclear, or does it try to find something else? And that's the interesting question for me.
Where is Iran's nuclear program today, and what is its future? Well, there's the stockpile question there. Yeah, for you. There was a report in Axios actually over the weekend that suggested that even Putin is in support of the US and Iranian officials reaching a nuclear deal that involves Iran not enriching any uranium. Is there a possibility that Iran could agree to this?
I mean, but that's always been the case. Nicole Krajewski did a good thing on Twitter a while ago about Russia has always sought control over Iran's nuclear program. So I'm not surprised that they want to hold the whip hand in terms of controlling giving enriched uranium to Iran. And this just reinforces Iran's point of view that even its so-called putative strategic allies will stab it in the chest, if it's in their interest. Again, the thing that I just have trouble realizing now is that why does Iran not just let go? I mean, the only reason it puts so much into its nuclear program is for this nuclear weapon potential, right? It only provides 1% of the energy. It's costing billions and billions in dollars in terms of sanctions and pressure from the West. But still, its red line today is we must enrich, right? That's become, I mean, irrespective of whatever benefits enrichment brings to Iran, domestic enrichment, this is the line in the sand that they've drawn themselves, and it's killing them. If Iran were to say, which it won't, yeah, we don't need to enrich, think how much easier strategically life would be going forward for Iran. But it's not going to do that. So it's going to maintain this death grip on domestic enrichment, it seems. I mean, it would be interesting if the U.S., I mean, if in fact the U.S. is sincerely motivated to find a diplomatic solution as opposed to imposing the terms of surrender on Iran, they might be able to play with that. If we could give some sort of perfunctory nod to domestic enrichment, but functionally ensure it doesn't happen in Iran, that's a possible way to find a diplomatic solution. But for whatever reason, I think largely, or in large part, not to personalize it too much, Iran thinks that any capitulation to the West is such a sign of weakness. It's like chum in the water for sharks, and it will lead to what happened to Saddam, what happened to Gaddafi, what happened to the USSR under Gorbachev. So the hill on which they're going to die, they seem to have picked domestic enrichment, and that's just going to keep hurting them.
Isn't that what's also influencing the internal debate within Iran? You see, not that I would call Arakshi a reformist, but I mean, you see him signaling. There's some signaling that they are ready to resume talks. They are ready for a diplomatic solution. But then within Iran, if you look at Iranian media, you see a lot of narrative circulating about some existential threat and pushing forward for armament, for nuclear armament as a deterrent at this point after the war. Isn't that what's contributing to this whole Iran will not let go of enriching uranium?
But they always did that. Even before the 13-day war, you saw people like Campbell, who was the former foreign minister, who's still a key domestic advisor to Khamenei, say, yeah, we might reconsider a nuclear weapon if we have to. So that red line, that line had already been crossed about, contemplating having a nuclear weapon as a strategic deterrent. I mean, Iran, that's the problem with Iran's use of the nuclear issue. It tends to do things for signaling purposes and pressure purposes that we see as part of an escalatory spiral. You know, we pull out of JCPOA and someone kills Fakhrizadeh and they say we're going to enrich to 20%. You know, we do something else and they increase to 60%, even though there's no reason to have 60% enrichment, right? So they keep trying to use the nuclear program both as a way to get attention and to draw concessions from the West, while the West sees Iran, these signals, as Iran moving closer toward possibly a nuclear weapon. So again, yeah, Arakchi, who's a really good diplomat, you know, and unlike Zarif, Arakchi is of the system, okay? He's IRGC, he's, as I say in Persian, a khodi. He's one of the guys, okay? So he obviously wants to engage the US diplomatically just because he thinks that's the way, that's another point of potential leverage. It's possibly a way of just stopping the next wave of Israeli attacks. But I don't think he's got any illusions as to what's achievable through diplomacy with the US. He just realizes that in terms of where Iran is strategically right now, the US is holding, you know, many of the cards, as is Israel, as are the Gulf states.
All right, thank you. Jason, given the relative success of the joint US-Israel operation in Iran, do you foresee potential future coordination? Where do you see it headed between the US and Israel in regards to nuclear negotiations with Iran or potential future military strike if talks break down again?
Yeah, it's interesting. You, I think a couple of concerns might be strong, but things I think we need to be collectively aware of. Um, the one of them is what I've kind of referred to threshold creep here. The U.S. was enabled by Israeli operations to go and damage the Iranian nuclear platform program. The response was largely choreographed. Missiles hit Al Udeid, but they were able to move forces off that and the Patriot batteries there to defend the base. Um, so I think one lesson that I would be careful to draw from this is that Israel and or the United States strike Iran at will without having with similar results. And as we talked about earlier, some of the concern about some of the other partner nations in the region about an Israel that is sort of given the green light to conduct strikes when it wants. I think the U.S. is going to, again, likely have to use some political capital with Israel in, I think, going forward, what are some of the red lines that they will abide by when I think the obviously if Iran starts to rebuild their program, if it starts to enrich it's highly enriched uranium, the six is available, and they start to enrich it further. That's obvious. That's a obvious red line. The missile program I know is of particular security and concern to Israel. I think they can come to an agreement there. But there's also some territory I think that we should be aware of is again in a very vulnerable position now with its fences, and its problems are on their back foot in many places, and Israel could see this as an opportunity to try to one or more of these targets justifiably. But I think the United States needs to be, I think, in close discussion with their Israeli counterparts on the extent to which the U.S. would be willing to along with some of these. I think we have to remember here that in the last few months, the amount of resources that have been devoted to build up and execution of some of these operations. We had carrier groups be reassigned for their parts of the world to come and provide one defense of Israel through Aegis and missile systems. We had the relocation of Patriot from Korea to Al-Udeid that took no fewer than 73 reported C-17s to move there to aid in the defense of the base. So these don't come without costs monetarily or strategically. And the U.S. needs to be careful and pretty frank with Israel in plotting a path forward that leaves some space for negotiated settlement.
Absolutely. What does the U.S. consider a direct security threat from Iran, and what could trigger renewed U.S. military involvement?
Well, I mean, the signal from the White House is that I think President Trump would like to pursue a negotiated settlement. He has expressed on multiple occasions interest in being considered for a peace prize, and some countries, including Israel, have had to help facilitate that. I think in general. They want to, I think, make some level of openness to some of these negotiations. Don't want to be forced into a bad spot by Israel conducting strike again on Iran or perhaps elsewhere that might scuttle progress some of these discussions. I think again on the nuclear issue, I think that's going to be pretty easy to come to terms with. On the missile program, should there be again another rapid expansion or some external help there, I think they can agree on that. Beyond, I think that there will be opportunity to sit down and discuss how to pursue some level of mutual benefits going forward without alienating other Arab nations and partners.
All right, Alan. Internally, Iran's air defenses have been crippled. Its security apparatus has been significantly weakened, and the war further exacerbated Iran's economic crisis. Can the Islamic regime afford not to engage with Washington?
I don't think its security apparatus has been hurt at all. It seemed to function relatively well. But certainly the rest of what you said, I have full agreement with. Can they afford not to engage with Washington? No, they have to. This is, and they want to. Al-Shaib is chomping. I mean, not Iran is chomping at the bit to engage. As I said, just because that's the petri dish where something's going to happen, right? I mean, Iran has a lot of balls in the air right now. There's still the whole issue of the E3 invoking snapback before the UNSCR ends in mid-October, which is troubling Iran mightily. And Israel, excuse me, the U.S. also is the only country that can potentially put a halter on Israel to stop future attacks. So Iran sees the U.S. as the key to just making it to the next episode of this drama, right? But it also sees that the U.S. I mean, the U.S. can never be trusted in Iranians' eyes, but certainly less so now, right? 2 days before the sixth round of negotiations, President Trump putatively green lights Israel's attack on Iran. I mean, ignoring the earlier withdrawal from the JCPOA by President Trump. So again, as I've alluded to earlier, I think Iran fears that when the U.S. says it wants to negotiate, it means it wants to accept Iran's surrender. Because one of the things Israel has done is now normalize new red lines where no domestic enrichment, no missile program, no support for proxies. So the sort of terms of that allows Iran to go forward that are in this, inside the strategic air are much more punitive on Iran than they used to be, and I think more punitive than Iran is willing to accept. So while the U.S. is the final destination for Iranian diplomacy, I don't think they're upbeat at all. And as I've also alluded to, it's an open question as to how much political capital the U.S. is going to devote to negotiations, vice just outsourcing it to whatever Israel wants. Steve Witkoff is very busy. I mean, the State Department's bench strength on Iran was suboptimal before, and it just cut, 1,300 employees, many of whom I'm told had, good Iran expertise. So, and even they weren't even being used regardless. I mean, this whole diplomacy with Iran was being run out of, Steve Witkoff's office with some minimal support from the State Department. So the real question is, what is the U.S. vision for diplomacy with Iran? Is it essentially punitive and maximalist, or is there going to be a good faith effort, which there wasn't before the war, to see if they can find a modus vivendi that modifies not just Iran's capabilities, but also its intentions, which is going to be hard.
All right. On the topic of Iran's proxies, Jason, its proxies have defined the Middle East for decades, but they too are weakened now. Is Iran now, would you say Iran is now relatively contained? And if so, how do you bolster that containment?
Uh, I think if you're looking comparatively, it's more contained than it has been again in previous decades, as I said earlier. And the weak of some of these proxies, we're seeing some great opportunities in the region. In Lebanon, they're working towards potentially disarming Hezbollah. Whether or not they ever get there, that's on the table. Syria, you're seeing again a regime not al-Assad coming together and trying to find a way forward. Work regional partners. So yes, there are opportunities here that the United States is strategically interested in. There are obviously other stakeholders in the region working. That being said, I don't know that you would say Iran is now contained. The Houthis remain again stubbornly we're in the Red Sea, and Iran is going to. It remains sort of, as Alan said, they're kind of sort of playing for time now and absorbing the effects of the last few weeks. But what they try to do going forward, I think, is going to be you know, likely robust in terms of whether or not they decide to rebuild their proxy network or to focus inward. I think they're going to remain probably the biggest security concern in the region for the foreseeable future.
Alan, what are Israeli red lines and how do they impact US-Iran talks and the path to a potential deal, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean that's the fascinating question in the sense that what's the delta? What's the difference between what the US wants going forward and what Israel wants going forward, and who controls that dynamic? I mean, I think Israel by its actions has certainly bought itself a seat at the table. I mean, when we were doing the JCPOA from 2010 to 2015, roughly, um, obviously everyone consulted Israel, but they weren't really feeding into our strategic deliberations. I mean, their red lines weren't necessarily ours. That's no longer the case. I mean, Israel, I think, has insinuated itself into the U.S. strategic decisions because it's done a lot of most of the heavy lifting in terms of in its mind cleaning up the region. So, wait, now I've been bloviating so much I forgot your original question. What was it? It was
What are the Israeli red lines and how would
yeah. So I mean, here's the key dynamic in my mind is that I don't think Israel wants to give up the tactical advantages it has achieved in Iran. Right now, Iran is buck naked, out in the winter wind, and it needs to find some clothing, right? And Israel doesn't want to allow that. It doesn't want Iran to reconstitute its air defense. It doesn't want Iran to build back up its missile forces because it expended a lot of blood and treasure to get to where we are now. So I think it's much like in Gaza. I think they feel they're gonna have to go back in at some point if, as is probable, Iran seeks to reconstitute some form of, first, minimal internal defense, and secondly, some type of ability to project power outside its borders. And so the key question is, does the US allow that? I think it probably will. So the red lines are, Israel's red lines are, it wants to keep facts on the ground in Iran right now, at least as favorable as it is now.
All right. Jason, what are the US's current security priorities in the Middle East? While there is a clear reluctance within the US for prolonged conflicts, recent actions like the limited engagement in Iran show a willingness for short, decisive operations. Can long-term involvement be outsourced to other regional players, perhaps?
The current environment, the outsourcing component is, certainly in a formal sense, I don't know, is on the table. As Alan laid out, I think Israel has sort of come way to the sort of the table in terms of what the balance of power it looks like in the Middle East, and I agree with Alan that they have a lot in maintaining Iran's current status, given its losses due to recent strikes. I also think in general, we'll see the battle damage from the strikes on the nuclear sites. But some of these trick, short term, we saw the Houthis, months ago, just earlier in the spring, a number of strikes against the Houthis, and supposedly was very damaging. And we're seeing now in the last few days that they remain again very resilient. So I think you're seeing kind of sort of two sides of a coin. On one hand, there's I think increasing justification for the pursuit of some of these political discussions when it comes to Iran and Gaza, and we're seeing, in Syria, other stakeholders come together, and you're seeing, again, the tactical success of some of these strikes, not necessarily having the same level of strategic long-term impact as hoped. So under the current, I think there can be sort of some settling of the situation now, and finding ways to, from the U.S. standpoint, incorporating sort of Israel's stronger hand here when it comes to Iran, when it comes certainly to Gaza, in Syria, and some of its discussions with Turkey there, but also find a way to productively fold in some other key partners in the region, not least of which, those countries where visited in his first international visit is in this term, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There's now it seems like Israel is sort of pursuing this more maximalist approach. I think the U.S. is going to have to be key in determining some sort of a balance here going forward, that it pulls in some of the other key stakeholders.
All right. Alan, any concluding thoughts? Anything we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I think that events of the last couple of years, we can pick the Hamas terrorist attack as a starting point, have led to a region that's far less stable, and far more likely to not move toward the regional economic integration that's essential for future regional stability. I mean, the Middle East right now, without going too far afield, is at the forefront of experiencing, the adverse effects of climate change. Most of its countries are water stressed. It's just harder and harder to get by. So at a time when you really need to have increased regional cooperation in the face of what is an existential threat, it's doing stuff like this. And it's going to be harder and harder to get away with that as time goes forward. I think Iran, right now, I'm more concerned about I mean, it's funny, a couple years ago, maybe you're worried about Iran, being the regional hegemon, being too strong. Everyone was applauding Iran's strategic vision. Now, they're on the ropes, they're on their heels, pick whatever, metaphor you want. But, at some point you have to start wondering about what the negative consequences of functional near failed state status in Iran will be. So that's what I'm thinking about.
All right, Jason?
Well, I think for me, it's going to be looking forward from a defense and security strategy, how the U.S. Sort of ingests the events of the last few months here, and looking forward to determining, in the region, it currently maintains a pretty significant footprint. But it's something that I think is going to have to, as I said, the political vision or goals or objectives for the region and how that impacts it ultimately posture going forward, given other global priorities, not least the Indo-Pacific. I think that it's going to be interesting to see how the last couple of months will impact those deliberations here in Washington.
All right, we've reached the end of today's webinar. Thank you for our audience for attending and for the great questions, and a huge thank you to our speakers, Alan Eyre and Jason Campbell, for their time and valuable insights. We hope you found today's session informative and engaging. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.